My name is Solène, and I was 31 years old the afternoon my two brothers called a family meeting and didn't tell me about it until it was already over. They sent a text. A single text from my older brother Darnell that said, "We talked it over and decided Mom's care situation needs to be simplified. Your visits are creating stress for her. We think it's better if you take a step back for a while." I read that message standing in the parking lot of the physical therapy clinic where I work. I read it twice. I put my phone in my pocket and went back inside and finished my last two patient sessions of the day because that is what you do when the ground shifts. You finish what's in front of you. What my brothers didn't know, what I hadn't told anyone in the family, was that 4 months before that text arrived, my mother had done something. She'd done it quietly during a regular Thursday appointment with a notary present. It was a document. One document. And the moment I read Darnell's message in that parking lot, I understood, in a way I couldn't have explained out loud, that the document was going to matter. I just didn't know yet how publicly it was going to matter, or who was going to be in the room when it did. I want to start with the kind of family we were before any of this happened, because I think it matters. Not because we were perfect, we were not, but because the version of us that existed before the fracture was real, and I don't want to flatten it into something simpler than it was. My name is Solène Abra. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the youngest of 3 children and the only daughter of Celestine and Raymond Abra. My father came to the United States from Nigeria in his late 20s, trained as an electrical engineer, and spent 30 years working for a utility company in central Ohio. My mother was born in Louisiana, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a man who repaired appliances for a living, and she moved north after college and met my father at a church potluck in 1984 and never went back south except to visit. They were a specific kind of couple, not demonstrative in public, not the type to hold hands at the grocery store, but with a quality between them of mutual recognition that I understood even as a child was something worth having. My brothers are Darnell and Kevin. Darnell is 7 years older than me. Kevin is 5 years older. They are both, in the ways that count on paper, successful men. Darnell works in commercial real estate in Columbus. He brokers deals for mid-size industrial properties and drives a car that announces this quietly but clearly. Kevin is a high school football coach and athletic director in a suburb north of the city, the kind of man who is broadly liked because he is broadly legible, confident, physical, the one who handled things in our family because handling things came naturally to him and no one had ever suggested it shouldn't. I am a physical therapist. I work at a rehabilitation clinic in Westerville, about 20 minutes from where I grew up. I specialize in post-surgical recovery and in working with elderly patients, hip replacements, knee surgeries, the slow and careful work of getting someone's body to trust itself again after it has been taken apart and put back together. It is not a glamorous job. It is the kind of work where progress is measured in degrees of flexion and in whether someone can lower themselves into a chair without bracing against the wall, and where a good day is the day a patient walks to the end of the hallway and back without stopping. I love it in the way you love something that costs you something real and gives you something real in return. I tell you this because it matters to what came later. I understand bodies. I understand what decline looks like and what it doesn't look like. I understand the difference between a person who is struggling and a person who is being described as struggling by someone with a stake in the description. My mother's name is Celestine, though most people call her Sully. She is 68 years old. She is a retired middle school librarian who spent 26 years recommending books to 11-year-olds and taking the work seriously in a way that 11-year-olds often don't deserve, but occasionally rise to meet. She is a woman of strong opinions about novels, about the correct way to make red beans and rice, and about the importance of showing up when someone needs you, a principle she applied consistently and without calculation for as long as I can remember. My father passed away 6 years ago. A stroke, quick, at 64, the kind of death that gives you no preparation and no ceremony, that simply removes a person from the room one morning and leaves the rest of you to reorganize around the space. My mother handled it the way she handled most things, with practical dignity and very little public grief, and then, in the months that followed, with the careful project of figuring out who she was without him. She stayed in the house. It's a 3-bedroom ranch on a tree-lined street in the Clintonville neighborhood, the house my brothers and I grew up in, the one with the covered front porch and the kitchen window that faces the backyard where my father used to grow tomatoes every summer. She maintained it carefully. She drove herself to her book club and to her church and to her doctor appointments. She did not perform frailty and she did not invite management. She was, by any reasonable measure, a woman navigating an ordinary widowhood with considerable competence. What changed was not her capacity. What changed was her hip. In the spring of the year before the text message, about 18 months before the events I'm about to describe, my mother had a fall. Nothing dramatic. She stepped off the back porch wrong. Her right foot landed at an angle, and she went down on the patio. She didn't break anything, but she bruised the ball of her hip joint badly enough that the inflammation compressed the bursa, and by the time she mentioned it to me 2 weeks later, she was compensating with her gait in a way that told me, professionally, that if we didn't address it, she'd be looking at a much larger problem inside of a year. I brought her into my clinic. Not as a formal patient. My clinic has rules about treating immediate family, but I connected her with a colleague of mine, a therapist named Patricia, who has been doing this work for 22 years and is very good at it. Patricia evaluated her, designed a recovery plan, and my mother came in twice a week for 8 weeks and did every exercise she was given and recovered well. Better than well, actually. By the end of the 8 weeks, her gait was stronger than it had been before the fall. I drove her to those appointments. Not everyone, she drove herself to some, but I drove her to the first several, and I came into the session notes with Patricia afterward to understand what was happening and what to watch for. I also started coming by the house more regularly. Once a week at minimum, sometimes twice. I helped with things that were reasonable to help with: the higher shelves, the back gutters before winter, the occasional grocery run when her schedule was busy. I didn't announce this. I didn't frame it as caregiving because she would have resisted that framing and because it wasn't really caregiving, it was just being her daughter, which is something I had always done. My brothers noticed the increased visits. Darnell, in particular, noticed. He mentioned it twice in my presence, once at a Sunday dinner at his house, once in a phone call, framing it each time as mild concern. Was I worried about Mom? Did I think she needed more support? I said I thought she was doing well and that I was keeping an eye on things, and he nodded and moved on. I understand now that those conversations were not casual. I understand now that Darnell had begun, around this same period, to think about my mother's situation in terms that had less to do with her well-being and more to do with her assets, specifically the house. The Clintonville house, in the years since my parents bought it, had appreciated considerably. The neighborhood had changed. Properties on that street were selling for 3 and 4 times what my parents had paid. It was not a mansion, but it was real money, the kind of real money that looks different to different people depending on what they need. I didn't know this yet. I'm telling you now because it's the context without which nothing that follows makes complete sense. What I did know was that something had shifted in the way my brothers spoke about Mom's living situation. Kevin brought up the idea of a senior living community at Christmas dinner. Not aggressively, just as something to consider, something to keep on the table. Darnell mentioned, once, that managing a house alone was a lot for a woman her age, and that it might be worth thinking about what made sense long-term. My mother heard these comments with the expression she reserved for opinions she disagreed with, but didn't find worth the energy of disputing, a specific flatness around her eyes that I recognized and that my brothers, I think, had stopped reading correctly. She mentioned it to me afterward, one evening in her kitchen when we were washing dishes and the house was quiet. She said, "Your brothers think I need to be managed." She wasn't asking me to respond. She was filing the information. I said, "What do you think?" She said, "I think I'm 67 years old and I know where my dishes go." We left it there. About 3 months before the text message, on a Thursday afternoon, my mother asked me to drive her to an appointment she described as administrative. She didn't say more than that. I picked her up at 2:15. We went to an office building on North High Street, a law office, small, 2 attorneys and a paralegal, and a waiting room with a plant that was doing its best. She went in. I sat in the waiting room for 45 minutes and read an old magazine. When she came out, she was carrying a manila envelope and her expression was the same composed and settled expression she'd worn into the office. In the car I asked if everything was okay. She said, "Everything is exactly as it should be." I did not ask what was in the envelope. She did not offer. I drove her home and she made coffee, and we sat on her porch for an hour and talked about a book she was reading, and at no point did she reference the appointment again. I want to say clearly, I did not engineer what followed. I did not know the specific contents of that envelope until they were read to me in a room with several other people present. What I knew was that my mother was a woman who did things carefully and for reasons, and that whatever she had done that Thursday afternoon was something she had considered thoroughly and completed on her own terms. That is the context in which you should understand everything that came after. The text arrived on a Wednesday evening in early October. I was in the clinic parking lot, keys in my hand, end of a long day. We talked it over and decided Mom's care situation needs to be simplified. Your visits are creating stress for her. We think it's better if you take a step back for a while. That was the complete text. Sent by Darnell. No call preceding it. No conversation, no warning, no invitation to discuss. Just a decision, delivered after the fact, from the account of my older brother who had apparently held a meeting with Kevin and arrived at a conclusion about my relationship with my mother without consulting either me or her. I read it twice. My chest did something that I can only describe as going hollow. Not a collapse, not a breakdown, just a sudden internal quiet, the kind that follows a sound you weren't expecting. I put my phone in my pocket. I went back inside. I had 2 patients left for the day, a 63-year-old man recovering from a total knee replacement, and a woman my mother's age who is 8 weeks out from rotator cuff surgery. I gave both of them my full attention because the work requires it, and because I have learned over years of this job that the act of full attention is one of the few things that reliably grounds me when everything else has gone sideways. I called Darnell from my car after my shift. He picked up on the second ring. I got your text, I said. Good, he said. I was going to call you tomorrow. What does step back mean? I asked. What are you actually asking me to do? There was a pause. We're not asking you to cut off contact. We're asking you to be less present. Mom gets wound up after your visits. She's mentioned it. She has mentioned it to you, I said. Those words. She doesn't always have to say it directly, Solène. We can read her. I'd like to hear it from her, I said. That's exactly the kind of pushback that makes things harder for her, he said. If you call her and make this about you, that stresses her out. We're trying to simplify her life. He was calm. He was completely calm, and he was using the language of care, stress, simplify, wound up in a way that was designed to make any disagreement for me look like evidence of the problem. I recognized the architecture of the argument. I just didn't know yet how to dismantle it. Kevin's in agreement, I said. Kevin thinks it's the right call, Darnell said. We talked it through. It's not permanent. Just give it some space, let her settle into a routine, and we'll reassess. I asked, does she know you're having this conversation with me? Another pause. Shorter. She trusts us to handle logistics, he said. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, okay, Darnell. I hear you. I hung up. I sat in my car for a long time in that parking lot watching the light change. Here is what I understood. My brothers were not malicious in the way that makes a clean story. They had convinced themselves, to some significant degree, that they were right. That is almost harder to navigate than outright bad faith, because there is no seam to point to, no moment where the lie shows through cleanly. Darnell had decided he was managing a situation, and Kevin had agreed because Kevin generally agreed with Darnell, and together they had built a structure around my mother that felt, from the inside, like concern. What I also understood, and this is the thing I held on to, was that my mother had not said those words. She trusts us to handle logistics. I knew my mother. I knew how she spoke and what she said, and what she didn't say. And the idea that she had described my visits as creating stress, that she had handed my brother's authority over my access to her, that did not fit. It did not fit the woman on the porch talking about her book. It did not fit the woman in the car with the manila envelope and the settled expression. I called my mother that evening. She picked up immediately. Darnell called me, she said before I could speak. He texted me, I said. A silence that had texture. I see, she said. Mom. Did you ask them to do this? I did not, she said. Her voice was even, careful. But I want you to listen to me for a moment. I need you to not make a scene right now. I need you to give me a little room to handle something. Can you do that? I said I could. Good, she said. I love you. I'll call you. She called me twice that week from her cell phone, brief calls, checking in. She did not explain. She did not offer more than she had. And I, because she had asked me to give her room, did not push. Over the next 8 months, I stepped back. Not completely, I would not have been able to, and I don't think she wanted me to disappear entirely, but I stopped coming by the house. I stopped calling daily. I let the structure my brothers had built stand outwardly, while I paid attention to the edges of it. The edges is where Miriam came in. Miriam Cole is 71 years old and has attended the same church as my mother for 19 years. She is a small woman with very good posture and the particular social fluency of someone who has spent decades navigating church committees. She knows everyone. She is trusted by everyone, and she has a gift for moving through a space without announcing herself. She brought my mother dinner every Wednesday. She had done this since my father's death, as a standing arrangement, a practical act of friendship that my mother had allowed because Miriam was not performing it. She was just doing it. Miriam also called me. Not every week, every few weeks, from her landline in the evenings. She would tell me how my mother seemed, what she had eaten, whether she'd mentioned her hip, whether she seemed sad or tense or off. She would tell me, without editorializing, when Darnell had been by, what they'd talked about as far as she could tell, whether my mother had seemed settled after or unsettled. Miriam did not see herself as a spy. She saw herself as someone who cared about two people and was keeping both of them informed. That is a distinction that matters. What Miriam told me, across those 8 months, was a pattern. Darnell was visiting regularly, more regularly than he had before. He was coming by with Marcus, his business partner, in addition to his wife. He had arranged, apparently with my mother's agreement or at least her absence of protest, for someone to come and assess the house's condition. He had mentioned, more than once in Miriam's hearing, that the house was too much for Mom to manage alone, and that a transition to something smaller made a lot of sense. My mother, according to Miriam, was politely noncommittal. She had a way of hearing a thing fully and responding to it in a way that neither agreed nor refused, and Darnell, apparently, had decided that this meant she was persuadable. Kevin was less present than Darnell but consistent in his support of whatever Darnell decided. In one conversation that Miriam overheard, she was in the kitchen while they were in the living room. She was clear to tell me she wasn't straining to listen. Kevin said, "Darnell knows what he's doing. If the house makes more sense as a sale and we find her something smaller, that's a better situation for everybody." Everybody. I held that word for a long time. I also held the information which Miriam gave me carefully and once, in case I hadn't understood, that Darnell had, at some point in this period, floated the idea to my mother that signing a financial power of attorney in his name would allow him to manage the house transition more efficiently, and that my mother had said she would think about it. She had been thinking about it, apparently, for 3 months when the APS officer knocked on her door. I did not call Adult Protective Services. I want to be completely clear about this because it matters to how the story is read. The call came from Miriam. She had placed it not as a report of abuse. There was no abuse, but as a welfare check. She had gone to the house on a Wednesday with dinner, as she always did, and found my mother sitting in the kitchen looking at a document she hadn't seen before. My mother had not shown her what it was, but something in her expression, Miriam described it as the look of someone who had been handed something in a foreign language and told to sign, had worried Miriam enough that she made the call the following morning. The APS system in Franklin County does not move quickly. I knew this professionally. What I didn't know was how a welfare check worked from the inside, from the family side, until it happened. The officer's name was Patricia Osei. She was, Miriam told me afterward, a middle-aged woman in a blue fleece vest who arrived with a clipboard and a manner that was entirely without urgency, the demeanor of someone who has done this work long enough to understand that the way you enter a room determines a great deal about what you find in it. She knocked. My mother answered. She was invited in. I was not there for this visit. My mother called me that evening to tell me about it. "A nice woman came by," she said. "From the county." I kept my voice level. "What did she want?" "To talk," my mother said. She had some questions. About my situation. About who was helping me with things. "What did you tell her?" A pause. "I told her the truth," my mother said.
She did not say more than that.
I did not ask more. But something in her voice had shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way another person might have caught. Just a particular quality of being settled, the same quality I had heard in her voice in the car outside the law office on North High Street. 2 weeks after that visit, I received a call from Patricia Osei's office. Not from her directly, from an intake coordinator who told me that the welfare check had produced a follow-up and that there was a review scheduled, and that as a family member I should be aware that a meeting would be convened with relevant parties. Relevant parties. I wrote that down. The meeting was held at the APS office on Marconi Boulevard on a Thursday morning in early March. The room was functional, a table, chairs, a window with a view of a parking structure, a whiteboard with something unrelated still written on it from a previous meeting. I arrived first. I sat down and put my hands flat on the table and breathed. Darnell and Kevin arrived together. Darnell came in assessing. His eyes moved around the room in the practiced way of someone who enters every room calculating the dynamics before he decides how to hold himself. He saw me and his face did a thing. Not surprise exactly, more like the brief recalibration of someone who had expected the room to look one way and found it looked another.
"Solène," he said. "Hey," I said.
Kevin nodded at me. His jaw was set in the way it gets when he's uncertain but committed to appearing otherwise. Patricia Osei came in last with a colleague, a woman who introduced herself as a supervisor, Karen, who sat slightly to the side and took notes throughout. Osei had her clipboard and a folder, and the same absence of urgency I'd heard described. She thanked everyone for coming. She explained that this was a review, not a formal proceeding, and that its purpose was to ensure my mother's situation was understood clearly and that her expressed wishes were on record. She said the phrase, her expressed wishes, in a way that was completely neutral and that landed in the room with the weight of something much heavier than its 3 words. Darnell's posture, across the table, was very controlled. His hands were flat like mine. Kevin was watching Osei with the focused attention of someone who has not yet decided whether this is a problem he can manage. "Before we go through the review findings," Osei said, "I want to share a document that was provided to this office by Celestine Aber's attorney." She opened the folder. My chest went very still. The document was a healthcare power of attorney and a durable financial power of attorney, both executed 9 months earlier. The Thursday afternoon, I had driven my mother to the office on North High Street and sat in the waiting room reading an old magazine. The healthcare POA named me as primary agent. The financial POA named me as primary agent. Both documents included a notarized certification of my mother's competence at the time of signing, attested by the attorney and the notary. Both were filed with the county. Both had been provided to APS, Osei explained, by my mother's attorney at my mother's request, a request made, according to the attorney's cover letter, the week after Miriam's welfare check. My mother had known the documents were in that attorney's office. She had known for 9 months. She had waited, through the text message, through the 8 months of my stepping back, through Darnell's visits and his conversations about the house and his quiet campaign to position himself as the logical administrator of her affairs. She had waited until there was a room, a table, and a neutral official with a clipboard and a folder. Then she had provided the documents. I sat very still. My hands were flat on the table. Something behind my sternum had gone very quiet, the way a room goes quiet just before something is formally announced. Osei read the key provisions in her even, procedural voice. She read my name as healthcare agent. She read my name as financial agent. She read the clause that specified that neither document could be superseded without a formal competency review and a court order. Darnell's face went through something I watched without comment. It started with a stillness that was the opposite of his usual controlled assessment, the stillness of a person who has just understood that the foundation of an argument they've been making for a year is not there. Then his jaw tightened. Then he looked at the table. Kevin made a sound of very small, controlled exhale, the kind that isn't quite a word. "Are these consistent with Celestine's current wishes?" Osei said, looking at her notes.
"Yes."
I spoke with Celestine directly during the welfare check, and she confirmed both documents, confirmed her understanding of their contents, and confirmed that they reflect her wishes as of today. She looked up. She looked at Darnell, then at Kevin, then at me. Her expression did not change. The welfare review will be closed as resolved, she said. There are no concerns regarding Celestine's safety or care. The question of her financial and healthcare decision-making is answered by the documents. If there are no questions, we can conclude. There were no questions. Not from Darnell. Not from Kevin. Not from me, because my question had just been answered in a room with 2 APS officers and my 2 brothers as witnesses, and the answer was the one my mother had prepared 9 months ago on a Thursday afternoon in a law office on North High Street. The supervisor closed her notebook. Osei said, "Thank you all for coming in." I picked up my bag. I stood. I looked at my brothers, not with triumph, because there wasn't triumph in me at that moment, just a very deep and specific kind of quiet. I said, "I'll see you." Neither of them said anything. I walked out into the hallway. The fluorescent light was ordinary. The carpet was the standard commercial kind. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood there while it came. When the doors opened, I stepped in. I pressed the lobby button. I watched the doors close. I drove to my mother's house. She was on the front porch when I pulled up. She had a mug of coffee and she was wearing her good cardigan, the deep burgundy one she saves for things that matter, and when she saw my car she raised the mug slightly, not a wave, just a small acknowledgement, like a period at the end of a long sentence. I sat next to her. She handed me the other mug she'd brought out. I took it. We sat for a while without talking. The street was quiet. A neighbor's dog barked twice and stopped. The light was the pale, clear light of early March, not warm yet but honest, the kind of light that shows you exactly what things look like. "They called you?" I said. "The attorney called me when APS contacted his office," she said. "I told him to give them everything." "You knew this would happen." "I prepared for it," she said. "There's a difference." She sipped her coffee. "I hoped it wouldn't have to. I hoped your brothers would settle down. But when Darnell started talking about the power of attorney, she shook her head once. I wasn't going to wait any longer." I looked at her. 9 months, Mom." "I know," she said. "You carried that for 9 months and didn't tell me." She looked back at me with the eyes of a woman who has thought this through thoroughly. "If you had known, you would have acted differently. I needed them to see what you actually do, not what you do when you know someone is watching." A pause. "You came every month anyway. You answered every time I called. You let me ask you to step back, and you stepped back, even though I know it cost you." My throat did something I had to work to keep steady. "It cost me a lot," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry for that part." We sat there until the coffee was gone. She told me that Darnell had already called her, twice, by the time I arrived. The first call had been controlled. The second had been less so. He had said he felt blindsided, that he hadn't understood the situation, that he'd only been trying to look out for her. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him I know," she said. "And I told him that looking out for someone and listening to someone are different skills, and that one of them requires you to be quiet long enough to hear the answer." I thought about that for a moment. "He took that well?" She made a small sound that was almost a laugh. "He'll take it eventually," she said. "He needs time to be angry first. Kevin will follow wherever Darnell goes, so I'll wait on both of them." Over the days that followed, the calls arrived. Darnell called me once, a brief, strained conversation in which he said he felt the situation had been handled in a way that wasn't necessary and that he hoped we could have a real conversation as a family soon. I said I agreed that a real conversation would be good. I did not apologize. There was nothing to apologize for, and I'd learned, watching my mother, that false apologies don't actually smooth anything. They just defer the honesty. Marcus, Darnell's business partner, who had been part of the conversations about the house, sent a text that was clearly drafted carefully and said little. I didn't respond to it because it was addressed to a version of the situation that had nothing to do with me. Kevin called once about a week later, on a Sunday evening. He was quieter than I expected. He said, "I should have called you when Darnell first brought this up." I said I appreciated him saying so. I meant it. Kevin and I have always had a more direct line than Darnell and I could hear in his voice that he was doing the thing he does when he knows he was wrong, not making a production of it, just sitting in it. An aunt on my father's side called me because she'd heard something through the family network, a compressed and somewhat distorted version of events, and wanted to understand what had happened. I told her, briefly and without embellishment. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your mother always knows exactly what she's doing." I said yes. I said that was the thing people sometimes forgot. The house question, Darnell's quiet campaign to position a sale as the logical outcome, had no mechanism left to operate. With a durable financial POA in place, any action regarding my mother's property required my involvement as her agent. Any conversation about a potential sale required her direct and documented consent. The structure Darnell had been building, the administrative logic he'd constructed over a year of careful positioning, had no foundation left. This did not mean there was a dramatic financial revelation. My mother's house is valued somewhere around $260,000 in the current market. Comfortable money, not spectacular. She has no plans to sell it. She has plans to keep living in it, with her Wednesday dinners with Miriam and her porch and her book club and her kitchen window that looks out on where my father used to grow tomatoes. The POA exists not to redistribute anything but to ensure that any future decision is hers, documented, protected from the kind of gentle, sustained pressure that can wear a person down if no one is paying attention. I am paying attention. That is, as far as I can tell, all she ever wanted me to do. The calls from Darnell tapered off over the following weeks. He did not stop talking to my mother. She wouldn't have wanted that, and I wouldn't have wanted it either, whatever my feelings about the year that preceded this. She loves her sons. She told me this directly, without apology, on the porch that first morning. I love your brothers, Solène. I just don't need them to manage me. He came to Sunday dinner at her house in April. I was there. It was not comfortable, not in the way that a family dinner is comfortable when everyone is operating in good faith and no one has anything to work through. But we sat at the same table and we ate her red beans and rice, and we talked about Kevin's football team and a book my mother was reading, and at the end of it Darnell stood up and helped clear the table without being asked. It's not fixed. I don't want to tell you it's fixed, because that's not honest. But we are, cautiously, in the process of building something that works, which is different from what we had before, and possibly better because what we had before was held together partly by the fiction that everyone's understanding of the situation was the same. It wasn't. Now it is. Here is what I know now that I spent a year learning. Presence is its own kind of document. It doesn't need to be announced or recorded or argued over in a meeting room. It simply accumulates. The drives, the appointments, the phone calls answered on the first ring, the afternoons on someone's porch when neither of you has anything pressing to say, but you show up anyway because showing up is the point. People see it. The people who matter see it. And sometimes the person who has been watching most carefully is the one who is quietest about what they've observed.
My mother saw it.
She built her response to it 9 months before anyone knew there was going to be a response. She walked into a law office on a Thursday afternoon, and she told a notary exactly what she wanted, and she left with a manila envelope and she waited, with the patience of someone who understands that the right moment is specific and that arriving too early is the same as missing it. I didn't know until it was over how much she had trusted me, not just with the document, but with the waiting, with the request to step back, with the faith that I would stay steady while she handled something in her own way and in her own time. That is the part one carry with me now. Not the meeting room and the folder and my brother's faces. The porch. The 2 mugs. The burgundy cardigan she'd put on because the morning mattered. That's my story. A manila envelope, a church friend's Wednesday dinners, and a document my mother signed 9 months before anyone needed to read it. If you've ever been asked to step back from someone you love, told to give space, to simplify, to stop creating stress, when you knew that wasn't the real reason, tell me about it. How did you hold on? And did anyone ever tell you that they'd seen what you were doing all along? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.